It was supposed to be a peaceful morning for Malcolm Davis, a hardworking IT consultant who had finally saved enough to buy a home in an upscale suburban neighborhood. His mornings usually began with a hot cup of coffee, the quiet hum of nature, and a smooth, uninterrupted internet connection, something he valued as he often worked from home. However, for the past few weeks, he had noticed something peculiar. His Wi-Fi had been running painfully slow, videos were buffering, and his online meetings were riddled with lag. At first, he chalked it up to his service provider. Maybe there was maintenance work, or perhaps the neighborhood had an unusually high number of users during peak hours. But when it continued for days, his instincts as a tech-savvy professional kicked in, and he decided to investigate. Logging into his router's admin panel, he expected to see only his devices connected. Instead, an unfamiliar device popped up, a device he had never seen before. The name on the connection history sent a surge of irritation through him. Karen's laptop. His brows furrowed as realization dawned. His neighbor, the ever-entitled Karen Whitmore, had been leeching off his Wi-Fi without permission. A woman he had barely spoken to, yet somehow, she had taken the liberty of mooching off his internet for what appeared to be months. Annoyed but composed, Malcolm changed his Wi-Fi password immediately, unknowingly setting off a chain of events that would unravel a web of deception far more sinister than stolen bandwidth. The next morning, as Malcolm sat on his porch, enjoying the crisp air and his now blazing fast internet, he was rudely interrupted by the sound of heels clacking furiously against his driveway. He looked up just in time to see Karen marching toward him, her platinum blonde bob bouncing with each aggressive step. She didn't even bother with pleasantries or a knock. Instead, she placed her manicured hands on her hips and glared at him with the righteous fury of someone who had been personally wronged. "Did you change your Wi-Fi password?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning serenity. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee cup down. "Excuse me?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "My internet suddenly stopped working last night, and I know you changed your Wi-Fi password," she accused, her nostrils flaring. Malcolm stared at her, utterly baffled. She wasn't even denying it. She was openly admitting that she had been using his internet, as if it were a basic neighborhood amenity. "You've been stealing my Wi-Fi?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes as if he had just asked the dumbest question in existence. "Oh, please, it's just the internet. It's not like it costs you anything extra. You people always make a big deal out of nothing." Malcolm's jaw tightened at the phrase, "you people." It wasn't the first time he had sensed an underlying air of superiority in Karen's interactions with him. But this was blatant. "Karen, it's my Wi-Fi. I pay for it. You don't get to use it just because you feel entitled to it," he said, keeping his voice even. Her face twisted in frustration, her eyes narrowing into slits. "I see what this is about," she sneered. "You don't belong here, and now you're trying to mess with the people who actually do. You think just because you have some money, you can move in here and act like you own the place." Malcolm took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Karen, I don't have time for this. You need to leave my property." That was the last straw for Karen. Her expression darkened, and before Malcolm could react, she yanked out her phone and dialed 911 right in front of him. "Yes, hello? There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood," she said, feigning distress. "He's trying to hack into people's homes. He's being aggressive, and I feel threatened." Malcolm couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was making it up as she went, fabricating a story right in front of him while keeping eye contact, as if daring him to react. She had done this before, weaponized the police, used her privilege as a shield. But this time, she had no idea who she was messing with. Malcolm didn't panic. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heels, walked inside his house, and sat at his desk. If Karen wanted to involve the authorities, fine. But before they arrived, he was going to dig deeper. As he pulled up his router's connection history and began scanning through her activity, his stomach dropped. At first, it was the usual streaming sites and social media, but then he saw something far more disturbing. Encrypted transactions, fraudulent websites, racist forums filled with hate speech. even traces of what appeared to be identity theft. And then, the final blow, a login attempt to a site flagged for trafficking explicit materials. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Karen hadn't just been stealing Wi-Fi. She had been using his network to commit serious crimes. And now, she had just called the police on herself. The distant wail of sirens cut through the tranquil suburban morning, growing louder with each passing second. Karen stood in Malcolm's driveway, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk curling on her lips. She had done this before. Called the police, spun a dramatic tale, and watched them take her word without question. This was her playground, her neighborhood, and as far as she was concerned, Malcolm was just another outsider who needed to be put in his place. But inside Malcolm's home, something very different was happening. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even worried. Instead, his fingers flew across his keyboard, eyes scanning the damning data he had just uncovered. He knew the police would be knocking on his door any second now. But before that happened, he needed to ensure that he had everything saved. Every illegal login, every visit to hate forums, every fraudulent transaction, screenshotted and stored. Then came the cherry on top, his security cameras. Malcolm had installed multiple high-resolution cameras around his home, all with sound recording enabled. That meant every word Karen had just said, from admitting to using his Wi-Fi to fabricating her emergency call, was caught on camera. His lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, Karen, you have no idea what you just did." Just as he secured the last file onto a USB drive, the hard knocks echoed from the front door. He exhaled slowly, squared his shoulders, and walked calmly to greet the people Karen had summoned to take him down. Outside, 2 officers stood side by side. One was Officer Ryan Jordan, a tall, composed black man with years of experience under his belt, and the other was Officer James Miller, a stockier, slightly younger white officer with skeptical eyes. Karen practically lunged forward before they could even speak. "Oh, thank God you're here," she wailed, putting on her best performance. "This man has been hacking into my personal information. I caught him in the act, and when I confronted him, he got aggressive. I'm terrified." Officer Jordan's gaze flickered between Karen, who was dramatically clutching her chest, and Malcolm, who stood calm and collected, arms crossed. "Sir," Officer Jordan said, stepping forward, "would you mind telling us your side of the story?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Of course, officer. But before we continue, you might want to see something." Karen's smug expression faltered just slightly as Malcolm turned, gesturing for them to follow him into his house. "You don't need to go inside," she blurted suddenly, a crack of desperation slipping through her polished performance. "Just arrest him. Look at him. He's obviously guilty." Officer Miller squinted at her. "Guilty of changing his Wi-Fi password?" Karen's face reddened. Ignoring her protests, the officers followed Malcolm inside, where he gestured to his computer screen. "I found something interesting," he said, plugging in the USB drive and pulling up the logs. The 2 officers leaned in, their eyes narrowing as they scanned the evidence. The color drained from Officer Miller's face first. Jesus! There, in black and white, were the clear digital footprints of Karen's internet activity. Login attempts to fraudulent websites, racist forums where she had spent hours spewing hate under anonymous usernames, and worst of all, a flagged connection to an illegal trafficking site. "Wait! These transactions, these are stolen credit card numbers," Officer Jordan muttered. Malcolm nodded. "That's not all." He clicked over to his security footage, where Karen's voice played back clear as day. "You changed your Wi-Fi password? You've been stealing my Wi-Fi? You people always make a big deal out of nothing." And finally, her entire false 911 call. The room was dead silent when the video ended. Karen's face turned ghost white. This isn't real. He faked this. He's a hacker," she shrieked, wild-eyed as she stepped backward, her entire demeanor shifting from arrogance to sheer panic. Officer Jordan rubbed his temples, exhaling deeply. He had seen a lot in his career, but this was something else. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, Are you seriously telling me that this man hacked into your accounts, fabricated all of this evidence, and made a deep fake of you admitting to stealing his Wi-Fi? Because that's a hell of a lot more believable than you just getting caught. Karen's lips trembled, her eyes darting between the officers and Malcolm, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is a setup. A setup. He's dangerous. You need to arrest him. Officer Miller let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Lady, you called us to bust a guy for changing his own Wi-Fi password. And instead, we just found out you're running a whole damn criminal operation. Karen lunged forward, wild-eyed and desperate. You can't do this to me, she shrieked, clawing at Malcolm's arm. That was her final mistake. In a flash, Officer Miller's hands were on her, twisting her wrist behind her back. That's assault, he muttered, clicking the first handcuff in place. Get your hands off me, Karen screamed, her voice going feral as she thrashed. I'm a white woman. You think anyone's going to believe him over me? Malcolm simply folded his arms, watching as her own words dug her grave. And then, she did the unthinkable. She turned to Officer Jordan, her face contorted with pure hatred, and spat. The entire room froze. Officer Miller's grip tightened instantly. Officer Jordan, he didn't even flinch. He slowly wiped his face, took a deep, measured breath, and then, with an eerily calm voice, spoke the words that sealed her fate. Karen Whitmore, you are under arrest for assaulting an officer, cyber fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. Karen's entire body stiffened. Her breathing turned shallow. No, she whispered, shaking her head wildly. No. This isn't happening. You can't do this. I'm the victim. But reality had finally caught up to Karen. And this time, nobody was coming to save her. The moment the cuffs locked around Karen Whitmore's wrists, her world shattered. She thrashed, she kicked, she screamed, but nothing changed the cold, hard fact that she was no longer the one in control. For years, she had wielded her privilege like a weapon, a tool she could use at will to destroy those she saw as beneath her. But now, standing there in handcuffs, with two officers barely suppressing their disgust, Karen had become something she never imagined. Powerless. Outside, the commotion had drawn attention. Neighbors gathered on porches, some peeking from behind curtains, others boldly recording with their phones. Karen had spent years acting like the queen of this neighborhood, judging everyone, calling HOA violations on minor infractions. And now the entire community was watching her fall. You don't understand. I'm the victim, she wailed, twisting in Officer Miller's grip as he firmly guided her toward the patrol car. Officer Jordan wiped his face once more, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, you spat on a police officer, he said, his voice controlled but cold. And that's just one of the crimes you're being booked for today. The words hit her like bricks. Crimes? Crimes. I haven't done anything, she shrieked. He set me up. That man is a hacker, a criminal, a thug. Malcolm, still standing in his doorway, simply tilted his head, amused. Karen, he said, his voice calm, almost amused. You do realize that you called the police on yourself, right? Her face twisted in fury, but before she could spew more venom, Officer Miller pushed her into the back seat of the cruiser, slamming the door shut. The reality of her situation finally began sinking in. Her wild eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to help her. But nobody did. Not a single neighbor came rushing to her defense. Not a single friend stepped forward to demand her release. Instead, people whispered. Phones recorded. And her fall from grace was broadcasted live to the world. Back inside the patrol car, Karen's mind raced. This was supposed to go differently. This was supposed to be like all the other times she had called the cops on someone she didn't like. She was supposed to be the victim. Malcolm was supposed to be dragged away, handcuffed and humiliated while she stood victorious, pretending to cry for the cameras. But instead, she was the one locked in the back of a squad car, her wrists sore from the cuffs, her chest tight with panic. No. This isn't real, she whispered to herself, trying to force herself awake. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. But it was. And it was only going to get worse. The unraveling of a life. By the time they reached the station, Karen was no longer screaming. She had gone silent, her face blank with shock as she was led inside, booked and processed. Her mugshot was taken. A single flash of light capturing the moment her life fell apart. But the worst part? It wasn't even over yet. Because while she sat there in a holding cell, arms wrapped around herself, waiting for someone, anyone to bail her out, her story was already spreading. Someone had uploaded the security footage from Malcolm's house. Someone had leaked her internet history, and within hours her name, Karen Whitmore, was trending. The headlines were brutal. Suburban woman calls cops on black neighbor, ends up arrested for cyber crimes. Racist HOA queen exposed. Shocking illegal activity found on stolen Wi-Fi. Woman arrested after spitting on black officer. And that's not even the worst part. The internet devoured it. Clips of her fake police call went viral. Screenshots of her hateful online comments spread like wildfire. And then the final blow came. Her job found out. By the next morning, Karen's boss had sent a company-wide statement. At company name, we stand against racism, fraud, and unethical behavior. Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore has been terminated. Her company email? Deactivated. Her work badge? Revoked. Her career? Over. The HOA turns its back. Karen had always ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. She was the one who sent HOA violation notices over grass being an inch too high. She was the one who voted against diversity initiatives at community meetings. She was the one who called the cops on a black teenager for riding his bike too close to her driveway. But now, the very same HOA she had once controlled turned against her. A special emergency meeting was called. The decision? Unanimous. Karen was officially banned from the neighborhood. Her house, once her pride and joy, became a financial noose around her neck. No one wanted to buy from a woman branded as a racist, a fraud, and a criminal. Her legal fees piled up. And within weeks, she was forced to sell her house at a loss, pack her things, and disappear. Malcolm gets the last laugh. One evening, weeks after Karen's arrest, Malcolm sat on his porch, sipping coffee. The air was crisp, the Wi-Fi stronger than ever, and the neighborhood was finally quiet. No more stolen internet. No more unwanted intrusions. And most importantly, no more Karen. His phone buzzed. A text from a friend. "Bro, you're a legend." She really thought she could get away with that. Malcolm chuckled. "She thought she was untouchable," he typed back. "Guess she found out otherwise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, he leaned back, inhaled the fresh air, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, it was a good day.